Hello and welcome to another episode of Market Watch. Today I have with me Subhashini Abesingha. She is the Director of Research at Verte Research. Subhashini, thank you very much for joining us today. Subhashini, just getting right to it, in terms of exports, about Sri Lankan's competitiveness in exports have been a major concern. How do you see Sri Lanka addressing this issue going forward?
Yeah, so I think that is one area that has not received a lot of attention, whether our exports are not doing well because we are not competitive enough in the international market. So when you're talking about competitiveness, how do you measure it? It's basically, can you meet the right quality, right quantity, right price? And two other things that often gets neglected is time to market. Can you deliver on time? And also the terms of payment. So payment terms also a very important area that a lot of people forget, like how much credit period can you give, because there is intense competition in the international market. How flexible are you with your buyer in terms of payment is also a critical element in getting exports. So I think we have focused a lot on quality and price to some extent, but we have not really focused enough on time to market and payment terms. So basically, another thing that we realize is when you're talking about competitiveness, the most frequently cited indicator is doing business index, trading across borders, right? So you look at Sri Lanka's ranking, out of 190 countries, Sri Lanka is ranked 158. And this is a country that is trying to be a trading hub in Asia, right? And we are trying to be a gateway to the Indian market, and where we are saying, doing business with India is easy and cheaper if you do it from Colombo. But actually, India is ranked at 119 out of 190 countries in the Doing Business Latest Index, right? And compare it with our competitor countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia. They're all at, like Thailand is around, they're 67, Vietnam in 83, Malaysia 77. So the thing is, they're all doing much better in terms of cost of doing business and the ease of doing business. So you're expecting Sri Lankan exporter to compete in the international market with having an inherently disadvantageous position in terms of the ability to do business faster, efficiently, and cost effectively in your own country. So see, our research specifically focused on what we term as domestic barriers to trade. So we feel actually you have a lot of barriers even before your product goes out of Colombo port that makes you uncompetitive. So we did one research on agricultural products, on domestic barriers, and especially agricultural fresh products are perishable. They are perishable in nature, which means faster clearing times are really, really important, right? So also most of our agriculture, people think it does not depend on imports, but in reality, almost all inputs from seed to fertilizer to chemicals to equipment, everything is imported for agriculture. So your import process also matters a lot in terms of your ability to export. So we found that they face immense problems, especially agriculture is one of the heavily regulated sectors, which is very critical as well because it's about human health and even environment, right? But that means a multitude of government agencies govern agricultural exports. But the processes, procedures, the transparency, availability of information, application forms, it's really very difficult for a trader to get any information. You have to physically visit every agency, and this is another thing we've highlighted in another research which said electronic signatures. One very fast way of reducing the time taken to process documents and prevent people from having to visit so many government agencies collecting signatures, right? But we passed an act in 2006, Electronic Transactions Act. Now we're in 2017. And to this date, Sri Lanka Customs and other board agencies do not accept electronic signatures. And Sri Lanka Customs, we can even submit documents online, but you have to print and sign by hand to clear the cargo. The entire objective of digitizing the processes is lost because of that. So I think, and digital signatures and digitizing border procedures is not a new thing in the world. There are so many other countries have done it. We are not even the first to do it, and we can learn so much from what other countries have done. And there is no reason for us to delay things over 10 years. Single window, you may have heard of this digitizing of all border agency procedures. We've been speaking about it for 2 decades. Actually, it was mid-90s Sri Lanka first started speaking about electronic data interchange at CAST border agencies. But to this date, we have not progressed. So I think it's very important to realize if you want your exports to be competitive, there is a lot of things that we need to do at home. And paying attention to these domestic barriers to trade, or some other people call them the supply side constraints, what our research finds is extremely critical if we want to succeed in exports.
And also, on that line as well, I mean, if in the similar lines, we've seen about a lot of talks about FTAs in terms of free trade agreements. So, what are the proposed policies for signing FTAs, and will this actually boost the exports in Sri Lanka, in the Sri Lankan export market? I've seen the export numbers not being so attractive at the moment. So what is, in your view, how do you see the FTAs actually aiding in this, aiding in terms of capturing more export markets?
So basically, free trade agreements as a solution to your export problem is basically based on 2 things, right? One is you're saying actually you have competitive products, your problem is markets, right? Because what free trade agreement does is it improves your market access. And the second one is you're thinking, okay, our product's main problem is barriers in other countries, right? Tariffs or non-tariff barriers, right? Various permits, licenses, all kinds of things. So if you feel that why our exports are not succeeding is because we have products, but we have entry barriers in other countries, and as a result, we are not succeeding in those countries, I would say free trade agreements are definitely a way to go. But what our research shows is actually our key problem is not markets, but products, right? So for example, the world itself is heavily concentrated in terms of markets. So you have almost, if you count trading nations, because trading nations are different from sovereign nations, like Hong Kong would not be considered a separate country, but as a trading nation, we consider Hong Kong separate. So generally there are over 200 trading nations, right? But if you'll be amazed, just 5 countries account for 38% of imports in the world, and just 20 accounts for over 70% of imports in the world. That's the reality. So your demand is actually very concentrated, which means you have only, like, if you want to succeed, you must obviously be in markets where there is the biggest demand, right? And so if you do a general number crunching, what you see is, if you look at Sri Lanka's exports, actually 45% of Sri Lanka's exports go to the top 5 importing markets in the world. And is this too high? So the way to check is you check with other countries, other successful countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, others, to see, is this an anomaly in Sri Lanka? And you realize no, all these countries, over 30–40% of their exports actually go to the top 5 markets in the world, right? Which is why they're successful as well. So this makes you feel, I mean, markets, we seem to be in the right markets. Then what's the problem? Why are we not growing in these markets? So then you realize your key problem is your products. You don't have the products to grow in these markets. So just like markets, there are, like, if you look at the international product classification, all the product categories in the world are categorized into 99 product categories. So out of that 99, just 5 product categories account for over 40% of the entire market demand in the world. So these are electrical equipment, machinery, plastics, jewelry. So there are like these type of products. But in Sri Lanka, if you look at how much of Sri Lanka's exports are in these products that are mostly demanded in the world, you realize only 7%. Okay. So in terms of markets, 45% of our exports go to the top 5 markets, but in terms of products, only 7% of our products are in the top 5 product categories demanded. Whereas if you look at even countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and all of Singapore, why are they successful? Over 40% of their exports are also in these top 5 categories. So this brings us the question, without actually focusing on products, can we actually export, right? And you realize our main export product is apparel, and the world market share of apparel is less than around 4%. Right? So your 44% of your market is concentrated in a product category that has 4% of market share, and you're not in this 40% market share of these big five products. And in one of our reports we investigated, let's look at China. I mean, China is one of the top 5 markets that Sri Lanka is very weak in entering. And so one would wonder, okay, maybe Chinese FTA is not a bad thing because China is one of the top 5 markets and it's one of the fastest growing markets, and can FTA help? And you just look at the products, right? And you look at China's import of apparel from the world. China is largest exporter of apparel in the world as well, but China imports very little from the world. Like total imports of China of apparel is less than 3% of their total imports, right? China is like the 14th largest market for apparel, right? And then you realize, you wonder, okay, now Vietnam has China among the top 5 export destinations of Vietnam. You would think, okay, Vietnam is one of the largest exporters of apparel in the world. Obviously, Vietnam must be exporting apparel to China. And you realize, no, Vietnam hardly exports apparel to China. What is Vietnam exporting? Electrical products, right? So you realize even the largest exporter of, one of the largest exporters of apparel in the world is not exporting apparel to China, right? So this makes you think, even if you want to enter China, your product basket will matter. Are you exporting products that China is demanding, right? So this is a critical question for us to ask when we think about FTA success.
So Subhashi, also in terms of the trade liberalization, you know, we have seen some of the measures implemented through the budget. They are talking about removal of para-tariffs. How do you see this actually affecting Sri Lanka? And do you think that we need to still be protecting our local industries, or will the local industry find it that they've been, you know, not protected through this? But how do you see this? How is there anything positive looking at it for the local industry or Sri Lanka as a whole?
Yeah, I think given that a lot of exporters are suffering from costs and inefficiencies that is beyond their direct control. So I mean, there are costs and efficiencies that are within your control, which is like your product quality development, investment in your machinery, labor, all of that. But most of our exporters and domestic industries suffer from costs that are beyond their control because of government inefficiency, because infrastructure not in, because your transport sector is not doing well, because your energy pricing is not right. So there are lots of things that are beyond their control that is really affecting their competitiveness. So it is fair to say a reasonable level of protection is important, because you have to actually address these things, because otherwise it's really not fair competition, right? Because you are receiving imports from countries that do have better doing business environments than your country. And then in addition to that, other, like in India, if people say, from other cost efficiencies to scale economies to labor costs to a lot of other things. But then in Sri Lanka, do we have unnecessarily high protection? I would say yes, because Sri Lanka has actually relatively a modest import duty structure. We have like import duties from, I think, 15% to 30% is the highest bracket, but 15%, 7.5% and 0. But our greatest problem is what you call the para-tariffs, these import cessors, right? So, and then you have another import-specific tax called Port and Airport Development Levy, which is also 7.5%. Imagine you are a product that is at 30% import duty, and then you get 30% import cess, and then you get 7.5% Port and Airport levy. You're effectively getting over 70% protection. So if your import is 100, you're 170. Right, so to me that is excessive, right? So import cessors, and also import cessors does this thing. So normally you also say you must have a very simplified tariff structure, both in terms of cost of doing business and also to collect revenue easily, right? So that is why we are saying the number of tariff bands. So in Sri Lanka you have 4 tariff bands, 0, 7.5, 15 and 30, which is okay, right? But import cessors, you will find you will have 15 different bands, 5%, 8%, 10%, 2%, 30%, 70%, and nobody knows what basis they were calculated, right? And what this does is people try to play, manipulate, evade taxes, right? So at the end of the day, you're really losing revenue, you're making a very complex system, you're encouraging room for a lot of corruption, and it is really not conducive. So from that perspective, removing import cessors are a good step, and it's in the right direction, I would say.
So that's more of a more forward-looking in terms of that.
Yes.
What is the outlook on global trade today, in your view? Where do we see global trade? At which point we see people moving out of FTAs already signed and trying to renegotiate some agreements. So where is, in your view, how do we see the global trade at this point?
So I don't think the international environment is that great for trade right now, right? So for several reasons. One is world economy is recovering, but not as fast as a lot of people would expect, right? And the two key markets, Europe and USA, especially for Sri Lanka, where for over 40% of our exports go to Europe and USA. And USA is recovering better than Europe, but Europe is really struggling, right? Which means when economies are not growing fast, which means demand for your products is also not increasing. And that is going to continue for a while, and that makes it a challenging environment for Sri Lanka. And then especially in the West developed countries, you see a sense of protectionism creeping in, right? Especially when you're talking about trade agreements, USA has been really one of the biggest pushers of trade agreements in the past decade. But you see that is slowing down, and they are rethinking their trade agreements. They withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They are trying to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreements. And even the WTO, I mean, basically World Trade Organization is considered one of the most important institutions for world trade, and now countries like USA is undermining the relevance and importance of WTO as well. So we are in the West, you see a step back in terms of open trade, liberal trade, open borders, and this is not necessarily good for countries, especially if your exposure to the Western markets is very high. And it creates a lot of uncertainty. Even Brexit creates, of course, creates a lot of uncertainty for Britain and Europe, but even for countries like Sri Lanka that is trading, it still creates an uncertainty in terms of what will happen, right? Once Britain moves, especially if your Sri Lanka depends on EU GSP plus to get duty-free access to European Union, but actually within European Union, UK is our biggest market, right? Then you wonder what will happen. But it's very difficult to say because it's a lot more complicated and not clear what is happening with Brexit and what's happening with the negotiations, right? And no one can say where it is going. So these kind of uncertainties actually create some kind of problem. This is where lack of integration with Asia is a key problem for Sri Lanka. So we live in Asia, and we are in a strategic location in the naval sea routes, and Asia is the fastest growing region in the world, and South Asia is expected to grow faster than the rest of Asia in the next decade. But somehow we have failed to export more to Asia. We import a lot from Asia. I mean, 40% of our imports are accounted for by India and China, but we hardly export to these countries. So I think focus on Asia is a good strategy to go forward, and it's going to be the future markets in the world as well.
So I mean, what you're saying is because the Western world is mostly, as much as going in for more protectionism at the moment. And then you see with, they're moving out of the trade agreements to rethinking some trade agreements. I think you're right to put, we haven't been too close to our own region, so maybe approaching these markets regionally would be a better strategy with our...
Definitely.
Subhash, what do you think about the commodity prices at the moment? I know we've seen a lot of research coming out, commodity prices expected to go up, and they're going to see commodity prices might increase, and with all, I mean, it's been a big concern for everybody, you know, deciding on rates, etc. So where do you see the commodity prices in your view?
Sri Lanka, I think oil prices is the biggest thing, right? At one time, oil accounted for 25% of our import bill, right? But I think we managed to, in 2015 and all, we managed to save something like $2 billion purely on the reduction of oil prices. But of course, we busted it with our lavish concessions and especially on vehicles, right? But the reality is that Sri Lanka is not going to see that saving, which will put pressure on what we call your balance of payments, or like your imports. Actually, even now, our exports are slightly growing, like growth is positive, because actually our exports growth have been negative in the past 2 years. But it's turning positive, but strangely our imports are growing much faster, simply because actually our fuel bill is pushing that. So that's something Sri Lanka needs to be aware of. And when oil prices increase, it has inflationary impact on every other sector in the country, right? Of course, going for elections, maybe government would be reluctant to increase fuel prices, but there'll be quite a pressure, then it'll put pressure on government budget, right? Because government will have to absorb those costs, right? Either way, the country will face the pressure, and how we are dealing with it. And for a long time, we've been asking for about a pricing formula for fuel. But to this date, we have not seen this pricing formula, right? So
I mean, it was a bit hopeful. I mean, they were saying that the electricity pricing formula would be in March, and then fuel pricing formula is expected to be in September. So I really hope they stick to it this time at least.
That's a good thing.
Again, just to close up, you know, with the oil bill going up as well, I saw it for the last, you know, in the September results are also out. We've seen that going up, and do you think there's going to be a huge impact on the currency as well?
So basically, the currency will be definitely under pressure if your import demand, like basically demand for your dollars, right, will be far bigger than your supply of dollars. So Sri Lanka's supply of dollars will come from exports, remittances, foreign investments, and loans, right?
Yes.
So our remittances are actually, growth is slowing down, right? And so you're not really going to see huge increase in flow, but we might maintain the existing flow. And tourism, again, if the latest numbers show, the growth is not impressive, right? So I think we used to grow at double-digit rates in both remittances and tourism, but now you're seeing it plateauing, right? So that means you're not going to see a lot of exports. Like I said, it's not a thing that you can increase overnight, right? And FDI, we are not doing that great. I mean, the best we've done is like 1.5 billion, and we are now struggling to hit even 1 billion. And for a long time, until 2010, we thought it was because of war we didn't have foreign investments. Now there is no war, but still we are not getting any foreign investments. So the reality is that, and that has pushed us to depend on loans and other these things for our for inflows. So we call them the debt creating foreign inflows, and that's not really a good trend to go forward. So one way is we really need to think, how can we manage our how can we increase debt creating foreign inflows, and FDI and exports are definitely two areas we should seriously think, but at the same time we should think that it requires more sustainable long-term approach, not just ad hoc piecemeal approach.
Yes. Thank you so much, Subhashi. It's been lovely having you. And thank you, everybody. This will be all we have time for today. And I hope to see you next week on Market Watch, and have a good day.